Mr.
Chair. Mr. Chair, I want to start in a similar vein as my colleague Grant Robertson. I remember watching some time ago now a long-form interview with the Minister around zero-hour contracts, and I did at that time detect a genuine concern about what was happening in the labour market. But of course, it was our role as opposition to make sure that any expressed concern was translating into very explicit legislation. And that's where I think I join my colleagues in highlighting again the really important role that opposition, and particularly Annelise Galloway, has played in making sure that we allow not one crack of light to be available for zero-hour contracts to remain in New Zealand legislation. And on first blush, that's exactly what this bill did initially allow. It allowed enough loopholes to remain that zero-hour contracts would still exist in New Zealand as we know them. But this, of course, was a vehicle we needed to use. If we simply voted against a bill, and we would be leaving the situation to hang, and that would mean that those contracts would still exist as they do now. So we were as constructive as we could be through this process, and Ian has done a fantastic job of getting to a point with the support of the Minister. We now have amendments on the table that will bring these contracts to a close. So, Ian, that's fantastic work, but obviously the Minister coming on board with that has been critical to this process as well, and we acknowledge that. I want to come back to actually some of the really excellent points that have been made in the regulatory impact statement around the clauses in this part and part two, particularly around 67E, around agreed hours of work in particular. Because it is quite difficult to size the number of employees who will be directly affected by this clause, but in the regulatory impact statement, officials have had an attempt to size the problem, because we do, as has been touched upon, we do know that those workers most affected by Clause 67C are likely to be those who are working in the service sectors, so retail, trade, accommodation, food service sectors, so 314,000 people roughly working in those industries. We can drill down a little bit further than that though. The Centre for Labour, Employment and Work found that 61% of collective agreements in the food retailing sector did not state ordinary weekly hours of work. 61% of collective contracts in that space. So that gives us an indication of the scale of use in particular service sectors. And the reason we should be doubly concerned by that, of course, is the level of vulnerability for people who are working in those sectors, and the regulatory impact statement touches on that. But what baffles me is that when we are talking about retail trade or particularly food retailing, there is a certain level of predictability around those sectors in terms of demand. I myself have worked in that sector. I was a checkout operator for a number of years. We knew the busy times, and anyone in this house who has been to a supermarket in Auckland on a Sunday knows there is a certain level of predictability around trade in that sector. I would say the same for the food retail business, particularly fast food. Again, I had the dubious honour of being a worker at KFC for about 6 months. Now, interestingly, I was not employed directly as a KFC worker. I was a contractor who job trained people with intellectual disabilities. So I was there to job train a young man with autism at KFC. I was in that place long enough to know the predictability of trade in that sector as well. So you cannot tell me that it is impossible to give a certain degree of certainty for workers in those industries. And that's obviously what this legislation will now require, and that is absolutely reasonable. That is absolutely reasonable. But why is it that we're seeing that happening in these particular sectors? Why is 67C so necessary to weed this out in those particular sectors? Well, I think what's interesting and brought up in the regulatory impact statement is The use of part-time, Mr. Chair.
Jacinda Ardern.
The use of part-time over casual is a way of securing employees. So a way of putting dibs on individuals, securing them for your business, but then giving them really uncertain shifts and hours. And all that does, of course, is shift the uncertainty from an employer who has the ability to make greater judgments about those ebbs and flows for their business, who obviously is in a more powerful situation than the employee. It shifts that risk from the employer to the employee, who's the more vulnerable in those situations, absolutely. And so, of course, where there is extremely tight margins or where there's extremely tight competition in a sector, that's where we're seeing these contracts used, and that is utterly unfair because that is where the power imbalance is so strong. And so in the regulatory impact statement, around the problem definition, I believe they're absolutely right to say that the root cause of this problem is an inherent power imbalance, but even having said that, to claim that where there is a more powerful employee, such a subjective thing to determine, where an employee has the power to push back on an employer around guaranteed hours. Very hard to distinguish where someone is in the situation where that is going to be an easier position to negotiate, which is why, regardless of sector, regardless of power relationship, it needs to be removed because it is inherently unfair. It is inherently unfair. I think it's also useful, though, because the problem definition around why we've come to the point of 67C is fleshed out even further in para 18 of the regulatory impact statement. Anyone who hasn't read it, I really recommend it. But it talks about the fact that actually this becomes problematic for the labour market generally. A labour market is not able to function efficiently if employers and their extra capacity is locked into an arrangement with a singular employer who then is not giving guaranteed hours. Now that may, and I'd be interested in this because I'm not sure if it's true, to what extent are our increasingly underemployed figures courtesy of this kind of practice in the employment market? Now, of course, the underemployed figures we see which are growing are people who would like additional hours but can't find them in the marketplace. And to what degree are those people unable to find those additional hours because their employment arrangement basically means that they are unable to go out and seek that additional work. They are locked in an arrangement that gives all of the power to an employer which deems them unable to fill the unknown quantity of work because they are essentially constantly on call without any compensation for that. So again, that's it leads to ultimately, if we did not have 67C redrafted the way it is, it would lead ultimately to it contributes to a labour market failure. But I do think it's also interesting to see that there has been some analysis to say that these unfair provisions had been used in place of proper due process where an employer has performance issues. So instead of sitting down and working through those performance issues and using the process that is set out in legislation, employers were using these powers to essentially push people out of work without having to go through due process. Another reason, because that was never the intention of this Parliament, that someone, rather than have due process, simply be forced out in almost a pseudo-dismissal process. Another point that I think is really important to make, the impact that this will have for currently people who have an interface between their work hours and work and income or income support, who had such uncertainty about their work. How do they get their support from work and income, if it's required, to be topped up when they have that level of uncertainty? Now, many of us will have seen this in their offices. I've had an individual come to me at one point, work and income, they had total uncertainty around their hours, absolute uncertainty. The hours for that individual was not guaranteed. They did require top-up from work and income. Work and income told them to quit, That is what that individual employee was eventually driven to because they could not support themselves, and work and income found it too difficult to work around the uncertainty of their contractual arrangement with their employer. So that is the flow-on effect of legislation which we are amending today, and why it is so important, Mr. Chair. So absolutely we support
Sue
that.
Moroney.